icsps. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. I think this is a really important topic. Right now on the screen you can see my email and phone number, so I just want to make it clear as we go on that if you have any questions following the webinar, we are here as a resource. We're always happy to help you walk through some of this because it can be pretty complicated, very technical, but hopefully today we're going to be able to present the information in a way that's easily understandable and really help you engage with some of these accessibility issues. So just a little bit about icsps. We are the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support. We create, support, and deliver professional development for career and technical education professionals across Illinois. We have a lot of experience working in special populations, one of which is students with disabilities. So that provided a really great opportunity to start to look at some of these accessibility issues. Along with that, we also do a lot of civil rights work, especially in terms of civil rights compliance. So the intersection of those two subject areas really created a nice topic for us to do some professional development around in regards to accessible communication. Right now, the web accessibility is a really hot button issue, and as we use the internet more and more and more as a standard of our communication, we'll really are forced to reconcile the convenience of creating this with the needs of users whose experience on the internet falls outside of the standard norm that we consider as we create communication in an electronic format. So once again, I'd really like to thank you all for being here today. I do think this is a really important subject matter, and I hope that as we go forward, we'll be able to at least have more consideration of these issues when we start to create our own content. So we're going to go ahead and get started, but when it comes to electronic and web accessibility, there is a lot to cover. In this first webinar of the series, we're going to limit our scope to just a few topics. The first will be an introduction to the civil rights legislation related to web accessibility and the expectations it lays out for your college or organization. Secondly, we're going to walk through a checklist of requirements and then discuss how to identify compliance issues on your own sites or in your own electronic communication on things like PDF and Word documents that you put out there for the public. During that discussion, we'll look at a few common issues that serve as serious impediments for people with disabilities, and we'll highlight a few methods for compliance. But really, it's going to be our next webinar series that focuses specifically, or our next webinar in this series, that focuses specifically on creating accessible documents and accessible versions of website. Our goal here today is to introduce the requirements and provide resources to help you self-assess your accessibility. I want to point out that this webinar is designed to provide a service and does not constitute legal advice. It's really important that if you're dealing with anything regarding legislation, you seek competent legal counsel because so much of this needs to be tailored to your specific circumstance. Laws are constantly changing, so please don't use anything within this webinar to substitute for competent legal counsel. With that said, it's my hope that you'll take some of the information from this webinar and begin the self-review process that will increase your ability to serve members of your community with disabilities. Now, before we go on, I do really want to mention that I have made an attempt to deliver this webinar in the most accessible fashion possible. So following our completion, it will be posted on our site. And to avoid making any significant changes in the content, there are several things that will be done throughout the webinar designed to help meet compliance standards. For example, there will be times when I transition from slides where I will read out all the content on the slide to ensure there's an alternative way to access information presented visually on the slides. I know for some people this is a pet peeve because you have to sit there and listen to me read content to you. But it is important because when we post this online, it will be in a video format. So things like screen readers wouldn't actually be able to access the text on the screen. Again, I mention this specifically because a majority of the violations are not done with malicious intent. Instead, they occur out of a lack of knowledge or consideration of user experience that falls outside the norm. This is definitely the case, especially when you transition from one form of media to another. So designing an accessible presentation in PowerPoint and posting it on a video, you lose a lot of that accessible content. And so I have to be considerate of how I'm going to reintroduce that content later on. I'm sure everyone here wants to serve our populations with the greatest extent possible. So in making the purpose of our actions explicit, we're attempting to increase awareness when it comes to our own design and deliver electronic communication at icsps. You're all demonstrating that same kind of intentionality and desire to improve by being here today, and I once again want to thank you for that, because the only way we can really impact our communication method is by making a real concerted effort to learn and change the way we do things. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So first thing I want to do is say a little bit about the purpose of ensuring college programs produce accessible communication. And on the screen here, I have a quotation by Secretary Arne Duncan, the Secretary of Education, former, and it says, "With a rapidly growing use of social media, electronic information, and the internet, it is particularly important that our use of websites, social media, and other electronic information comply with federal legal requirements for accessibility. In addition to our legal obligations, Secretary Duncan has stated that access to information for all, especially individuals with disability, is a necessary step towards fully engaging our colleges in ways that will help address our education system's greatest challenges and promote the successful work of our schools across the country." You can see there that that's from a Department of Education memorandum to the Assistant Secretaries from September 2011, and it's quoting former Secretary Arne Duncan. Now, the basic purpose of this is all to provide communication to everyone in our community, just to make sure anyone who would have difficulty accessing the standard electronic methods of communication still has access to that information. So as we go forward, we're going to need to consider a wide range of disabilities. It's really easy to consider things like users with visual impairments or auditory impairments, but disability services need to go far beyond that. So I would really recommend the first thing you do is familiarize yourself with some of the accessible content and assistive technologies that you'll get a chance, or that normal users would have the chance to use on your campus to access your information. That will really provide you a good foundation in understanding how those services and those technologies work, and then you'll be able to consider that as you design your communication to make sure that you are doing so in a way that makes accessibility a primary focus. So we're going to have a couple focuses today. One's creating accessible content and considering the user's wide range of disabilities. Some of these include visual, auditory, physical, speech, cognitive, language, learning, and neurological disabilities. The other thing we want to do is consider the user agent. So people with disabilities make use of these user agents, which are devices that allow users to access content, and they range from standard features on the web browsers and media players to complex assistive technologies. On your screen here, you can see that I've listed a few common features. So I've divided them into two categories. The first are onboard accessibility features. And luckily, these days, when we're working with a lot of really common programs like Microsoft Office, Adobe technologies, and almost any form of web browser, there are a lot of onboard accessibility features that are already there for users to use. So we have screen magnification, screen readers and voice recorders that are onboard elements of Microsoft Office, sticky keys, which is a system by which you can use one hand to log more complex multi-key functionality from your keyboard, and then the ability to disengage page style sheets. And this is something that is on board on almost all web browsers. And essentially what it does is transition a website into a more plain text version that can be read by assistive technology. Now, some examples of assistive technology are text-to-speech software, audio recording devices, screen magnification programs, closed captioning, and screen navigation devices. Basically, the wide range of assistive technologies are designed to help users with disabilities navigate electronic communication and organize it in a way that makes sense. So, with that brief outline covered, we're going to now turn our attention to the laws that govern or apply to web accessibility. Okay, brace yourselves because it's going to get exciting anytime you deal with federal and state legislation. But it is really important to consider that there are still ongoing court cases that are actually complicating this. So while these standards are the necessary things that you have to do to be compliant, it's always a good idea to go above and beyond the standard to make your electronic communication the most accessible possible. All right. So real quickly, before we really get into the standards, does anybody have any questions? You can go ahead and raise your hand if you have anything. All right. Is there anything over there, Amy?
There's no hands raised.
Okay, great. In that case, we're going to go ahead and get right in. So, the World Wide Web Consortium is an international organization that deals specifically with web accessibility, and they're actually referenced in nearly every law regulating the web accessibility in the United States. They are referenced specifically in the federal standards and in Illinois state law, and they've created 4 principles of accessibility that we will want to consider as we start to look through the legislation. So these 4 principles of accessibility are perceivable. Information in users' interface components must be presented to all users in a way they can perceive. They cannot be invisible. Operable. User interface components and navigation must be operable. The interface cannot require interaction that users cannot perform. Understandable. Information in the operation of user interfaces must be understandable. So that one's pretty self-explanatory. And robust. Content must be robust enough that it can be interpreted reliably by a wide variety of user agents, including assistive technologies. As technologies and user agents evolve, the content should remain accessible. WWC3, or WWWC3, as the organization is called, has created these to really encompass every element of the electronic communication. So there you can see a person's ability to read and understand information, their ability to navigate a page, and the interaction between electronic systems to present that information in a accessible fashion. So what are the standards? To start, we're going to look specifically at Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, because that is the federal standard that really guides electronic accessibility. It begins by saying, no otherwise qualified individual with a disability in the United States shall solely by reason of her or his disability be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. The statement applies to all programs receiving federal funding. Lack of access to information is considered a form of discrimination. So this is where the idea of web accessibility comes from. There aren't any specific guidelines within Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, but this section guides the spirit of all the accessibility laws we'll be dealing with. You cannot provide less information to individuals with disability because that would be considered a form of discrimination. So Section 508 of the Reauthorization of the Rehabilitation Act is where we're going to see very specific rules and regulations start to develop. So this element of the Rehabilitation Act clarifies the meaning of 504 related to electronic communication, and it is applicable to federal agencies, but outlines for the first time in legislation the accessibility standard and compliance language for web accessibility. Its purpose was to ensure when federal agencies develop, procure, maintain, or use electronic and information technology, federal employees with disabilities have access to and use of information and data that is comparable to the access and use by federal employees who are not individuals with disabilities. This purpose is incredibly important because it does require any technology used by the federal government to meet these standards. So that's web browsers, things like MS Word, all of those technologies that were dispersed wide and used commonly by government agencies or schools have to meet these standards. The American with Disabilities Act is also important when considering web accessibility. It does not directly deal with the internet or web technologies, but both Title II and Title III are applicable. Title II, communication with individuals with disabilities, is required to be as effective as communication with others. And Title III requires, or it provides guidelines for providing public accommodations for individuals with disabilities. And all of those, again, impact the spirit of the guidelines developed in Section 508 of the Reauthorization of the Rehabilitation Act. Within Illinois, we actually have more strict standards. So this is really what we're going to be looking at. The Illinois Information Technology and Accessibility Act, the IITAA, mirrors the 508 standards in that they are primarily concerned with the development, purchasing, and providing of information technology by government agencies. And therefore, many of the standards won't really apply to this conversation because they deal with things like developing new user interfaces or creating governing platforms that systems operate in. So I don't think any of us will be working on that. This is specifically for our specific focus needs to maintain on everyday user activities that you can do to increase web accessibility. But an example of a similarity is that both of the sets of laws provide standards for operating systems. As users, we can overlook those for now, but it is important to understand that all of these laws are designed to work in tandem with one another. So a lot of the groundwork has really already been done for us. We just need to understand what guides web accessibility and then know how to use the features that are already available to make our communication accessible. All right. There are also a lot of more advanced technology savvy requirements that are specified in these laws, and so some of that we're just going to glaze over because there are certain things with web accessibility that are really only possible to do if you're an IT professional. I mean, a lot of the guidance in the legislation has to deal with coding. So if you're very comfortable with coding, some of it will already be straightforward. And in that case, if you do have those skills, your best thing to do is look directly at the legislation and see how it guides you. So we are going to walk through all the guidelines, but our discussion will focus on topics the average user will encounter. One of the nice things about the IITAA is that each subsection has a how section for guiding you on ways to actually implement the requirements that are in law. So guidance for common programs may take some additional explanation though, because the law assumes that you are coding all of these things from scratch, and the vast majority of us will use other platforms like Microsoft Word or WordPress or FormStack to develop forms and websites that don't require us to do the hard coding. So I'm going to provide, this is a slide that actually links to all the different standards that I've referenced so far. The IITAA and Section 508 will be particularly useful because built into the legislation is kind of a mini checklist. We will be providing you a checklist later that are a little easier to use, but if you want a chance to look directly at the legislation, you can find the full standards here. The WC3, they have provided the single most comprehensive checklist of what makes a web content accessible. It is very technical, but it also might be a valuable resource for you. So, because of the intent of the IITAA legislation, web-based information standards are again going to be most relevant for our purpose today. It's more specific than the federal regs and applies directly to us in Illinois. So the IITAA divides its web-based standard into 18 categories. The categories are coding, text, color, image, image maps, sound, multimedia, animation, links, forms, tables, frames, scripts, embedded objects, downloadable documents, timing, page layout, and alternate accessible versions. Now what we're going to do is start to actually move through these requirements. So real briefly though, I want to provide an example of the guidance that will qualify under each of the IITAA guidelines. So later in section 15, the requirement is to provide natively accessible downloadable documents whenever possible. The IITAA defines what that means. So downloadable documents are often provided in formats such as Adobe Acrobat Portable Document Format, PDF, Microsoft Word, Microsoft PowerPoint, etc. Each document format has its own accessibility issues and may or may not provide appropriate techniques to address accessibility. As document is considered natively accessible if it follows the accessible techniques for its format. And then it tells you how. Check with the manufacturer and or publisher of the format and download document to determine if it can be made accessible. If accessibility techniques exist, ensure that downloadable documents fully implement these techniques and meet the functional performance criteria defined in these standards. So you can see that it's very helpful that the legislation clarifies what it means. Sometimes the how isn't very practical because checking with the manufacturer for guidelines every time you produce a document isn't really something that we're going to do on a regular basis, and they still allow outs in that how. So if accessible techniques exist, ensure that the downloadable document fully implements these techniques. That doesn't mean that the document itself will actually be accessible. It's just focusing on the native abilities that are already there. So one of the things that we're going to do as we walk through this is really clarify some of those what's and hows. So before we really get into the subsections, are there any questions yet? No questions at all. I know that some of this can be a little dense.
If you have questions, please raise your hand and I'll be happy to unmute you or post your questions in the question pane.
Okay, this is your last chance for a little while before you just get to hear me talking again. Okay, well, if we have no questions, we're going to go ahead and dive right into it. So, let's see. The first section is coding. So the requirements under this section are 1.1, use valid standard web programming code. 1.2, use appropriate markup to convey document structure. 1.3, provide meaningful title pages. 1.4, use headings to introduce sections and subsections and use them in correct order. And 1.5, use lists to identify series of related items, including navigation menus. The coding of a web page is incredibly important because it guides the way assistive technology interacts with that page. Many screen readers have advanced features that let users skip from things like heading to heading, follow organized lists, or allows them to navigate tables in a logical fashion. But if standard coding techniques aren't used, these processes aren't even possible. So further structural elements, specifically those identified in code, allow users with disabilities to understand the ways web pages interact or relate to one another. The IITAA provides examples of code that should be used and attached to provide document structure. However, if you don't have a decent knowledge of coding, I wouldn't recommend you try creating the HTML codes on a website yourself. The good news is that if you use a product like WordPress or another website creation program, many of these structures are added automatically, if you have access to the onboard features, that is. So if you walk away learning only one thing today, it should be that you should always use program and onboard formatting features instead of recreating those same features yourself using things like spacing, text size, or other tricks, because what that does is removes these tags and formatting structures that make them usable by assistive technologies. So on this next page, I have an example of some of these coding issues and the way that we use programs like WordPress to create the same content without having to use the coding languages, but also some of the real problems that can occur because of these shortcuts. So here you see two pictures created in of text that's created in WordPress. The text itself is just copied from the last slide, so it's not what we really need to be focusing on here. Instead, we want to really look at the visual layout and how the two compare to one another. So on the left side is text created using a visual layout tool that does the coding for you. It looks like the text would be created in a word processor, essentially. However, it's really important to know that these functions are not word processors, and so what actually happens when you type in and change things is drastically different from the types of things that you encounter in a Word document. Font options are separate from formatting options, and there are a lot of different ways to produce the same look, but in terms of how they're interpreted by web pages and assistive technology, the results can be drastically different. So each line on the left side has been created with a different coded structure. So while in the top thing, section number 1, coding, the 2 beneath it and the 3 below it all have similar fonts and are arranged in a logical fashion that you could follow it using a heading, subheading, paragraph style text. What's really coded into that isn't actually the case. So on the right-hand side, you can see the coding that's gone into creating these documents, or these lines of text. Now, while visually there's a logical downward order created by text size, the formatting menu that manipulates some of the text and the font menu were used to create those similar looks. In the end result, what you'd have would be a screen that is difficult, if not impossible, for a screen reader to read logically, because section 1, 1.2, and 1.4 have been created using the actual coding elements that hardwire in looks and heading features, whereas the other sections that have the corresponding looks have been done by manipulating font and size and bold and those sorts of features. So the way a text reader would actually go through this is read section 1, 1.2, 1.4, then 1.1, 1.4, or 1.3 and 1.5. So you can see that when you are using these accessibility features, or the things that allow you to produce content without coding, it is really important to understand that the things like heading options or the code that is attached automatically can have a drastic impact on the actual usability. Section 2 deals specifically with text. So section 2.1, use text to display text. And this is, to clarify a little bit, that means instead of images of text to get a specific style or font, and then it's unless formatting that cannot be achieved with CSS is required. Real quickly, CSS is a type of style sheet that is applied to and a coding language that allows your web pages to organize that, and that can be turned off in some web browsers. But the really important thing here is that when you use something like a JPEG or clip art instead of text, screen readers can't interpret it as text, so they can't read it back. Instead, they would interpret it as a blank picture. 2.2 is use relative sizes for font. 2.3 is identify the language of a text. 2.4, use images instead of ASCII art. So this is my very favorite line in this entire presentation, because that art is created with typed characters. So you can see on the screen an example of colon dash right parentheses is used to indicate a smile. If I were creating something that needed to be accessed by a screen reader, that would read, for example, colon dash right parentheses, not smiley face. As a basic rule of thumb, don't ever use that type of art. Instead, use a picture with an alternate tag so that it is accessible. The other thing to consider is that sometimes these punctuation marks that can be used to create art have specific commands that change the way screen readers interact, so you can cause some real inadvertent issues by typing smiley faces or sad faces or winky faces or whatever you prefer. So let me see. So section 2.1 again applies to clip art. Section 2.3 is most relevant when using phrases from multiple language within a text that would produce, or for example, producing notices in multiple languages all on the same sheet. You need to specify that that code is in another language, and the legislation that will be provided to you, and you've seen earlier, has specific recommendations on how that's done. But it's important because if you write "se habla español," unless the screen reader knows it should be Spanish and not English, it will try to produce it phonetically and read it more or less as gibberish.
Casey, we have a question.
Oh, great.
Do you think a framework for coding HTML like Bootstrap would be better or worse for accessibility?
I think that's a really good question, because all of these frameworks, if they are designed to be used by a wide user base, will take things into consideration like electronic accessibility. It's just something they have to do. So I would say it's probably better generally, but again, it's all going to be about how you execute, because there's a difference between knowing proper coding technique and using it, and then also using the techniques that make code the most accessible. So as we go through, we're going to see a lot more examples of using alternate programs or different types of coding languages that achieve really good functionality but are completely inaccessible. And this problem occurs because a lot of times people who are designing coding languages or frameworks for coding, or even doing the coding on websites, just aren't thinking about the engagement with assistive technologies. So what I would say the best thing is, no matter what you use, just try to be aware of the issues and what the requirements are, and then adequately test your finished product. Go through and make sure that assistive technologies work on it. Run the resources that we'll be providing you at the end of this presentation, because that's going to be how you'll see if you have problems or not. Okay. Are there any other questions there? All right, then we're going to move on to section 3, which is color. We're not going to spend a lot of time on some of these sections, including this one, because they can be pretty self-explanatory, but I seem to have mixed up the order on these. So 3.1 is do not convey information with color alone. Text must have a contrast ratio of 3.1, 7.1 is best. 3.2 is use contrasting foreground and background colors. The purpose for this is that you or a user with visual impairment can't make sense of contrasts that are below a certain rate. And that's really all there is to say about that. There are ways to test your contrast ratios, though. So there are a wide variety of free color testers online that will check them for you. They all pretty much work the exact same way. You either plug in your RBG numbers or your color hex codes, and they tell you what the contrast ratio between the two is. Some of them you'll be able to plug in one color and it will give you the best possible contrast matches for background colors. Either way, it's a good idea to make use of those. In fact, there are so many, simply Googling color ratio tester will give you hundreds of options. The one thing I would say is it's always a good idea to avoid combinations of red and green. They are particularly problematic for people with different types of color blindness, and you should just avoid using them in contrast to one another. We'll move on to section 4 here, which is images. Section 4 is one of the most basic and most important elements of accessibility. Images, unfortunately, are one of the most overlooked elements regarding accessibility when it comes to document creation, though. The criteria here are 4.1, provide appropriate alternate text for all images, and that'll be referred to as alt text for the rest of the webinar. And I have an asterisk there, and then 1194.22a. That's the 508 standard that regulates that under Section 508. And I have it in here because it's a particularly important one. It is considered a high priority for all web accessible documents, and it is something that you can use and change at the point of creation every single time. Once it becomes habit, it's incredibly quick to do, and it really increases the functionality of your documents. So for images that contain words or letters, use alternate text that includes the same words or letters. You can see that on things like the icsps logo. When we provide an alternate text, it generally says Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support logo, impacting educational equity, with stylized letters icsps. It's a pretty simple explanation, but it conveys all the same information that a picture of our logo would. For image links, use alternate text to identify the link's destination or function. You do not need to use the words or include the words link to. This is really important if you're going to use a picture that redirects to another website. The thing to remember is that the important element to communicate to a user with disabilities isn't necessarily what's in the picture. It's that it directs you somewhere else, and they need to know more about that destination. A lot of assistive technologies require you to actually use a cursor to click on an object to read it. So this is another thing that's very important, because the second it's highlighted, it will read out the picture, and then they have the option to click on it or not. If you just describe the picture by clicking on it, they might believe they're moving to the next part of your website and be redirected. The final part of that is for images that are invisible, purely decorative, do not convey meaning, or completely redundant with text that is already on the screen, use alt equals then quotation marks with nothing in them. So that's called the empty string command to indicate that the image can be safely ignored by a screen reader. You can usually do this in an alt editing command in things like Word or PowerPoint. On websites, you'll generally have to go in and add this code directly to the image if you're not using some sort of program that allows you to, kind of left click and drop down for alt text. It's a very simple command though. When you are using some other program, just put empty quotation marks. Essentially, a screen reader will read it as a blank quote and just skip over it. So requirement 4.2, provide full descriptions for graphs, diagrams, and other meaningful images. Present a full description of a meaningful image either on the page on which the image appears or through a link immediately preceding or following the image. Use alternative text to provide a concise name for the image. For example, the alternative text of a graph should state its title, and the full description should summarize its trends and/or present a table of its data. This is especially important when copying tables or screen captures from other programs. When I edit documents that are needing to be made accessible, this is the single most common error I run across. Part of the reason is because when you copy something from Excel, it's very easy to convert it to a JPEG and embed it, as opposed to embedding the table itself with all the formatting features and trying to reformat it to fit your new document. If you use that technique, a screen reader will show it as blank. So I would highly recommend that you always provide summaries of every graph and chart on every document you do. That way, if for some reason you miss the proper accessibility features, the information is still presented to everyone. In the next webinar in this series, we'll show you how to add alt text to different objects and different programs, but it is a relatively simple task. Importantly, the alt text for all of these images and graphs and diagrams provides equal access for information, and that's what the law really requires. So your description must be highly contextualized, focus on relevant information, and inform the user of any elements that are important. So on this slide, I've provided an example of a website title page that we've created for the integrated career and academic preparation system, I think is what it's for here. Yeah, integrated career and academic preparation system. It goes by the title ICAPS. So when you look at this screen, you can see that there are a wide range of elements that could be important to any type of user. And how you're going to alt text this will really depend on the context of your presentation. So I have on the left side some possible alt text elements of this picture. Descriptions of the website, its purpose and content is one possibility. Providing a list of writing, pictures, and layout that is present on the site is another, or a simple contextual description of how this picture fits into the presentation. So in this case, I've decided on the final option, and the alt text for the document that this will be published in will say, picture provided to show multiple considerations that go into creating alt text for screen captures of websites. The focal areas of the screen capture include a navigation bar that the screen reader could not read, and icons across the bottom that have meaning that would not be evident to existing technology or assistive technology. This is really here to show you that you can describe images in a lot of ways. One of the things I've heard consistently is that it really helps to think about how you would describe a picture over the phone. But I think that's a little too simple. It's more important to remember the information that an image conveys and the purpose of using it in your work, and then describe that instead of the aesthetic elements of a picture. Okay, so section 5 is image maps. This term, I'm sure, is familiar to some of you, not to others. An image map is simply one image that provides embedded links that are broken up into multiple areas. So the regulations here that govern it are provide alternate text for each area in the client-side image map, and 5.2 is use client-side image maps instead of server-side image maps unless areas cannot be defined with available shapes. So I have this picture at the bottom here to kind of give an example of this that we can examine. This is one picture, and I'm sure it's something that you've run across before as you've surfed the web. But each of these icons would then be broken up into areas that, when clicked, will take you to a different destination. Point 5.2 here relates to where the data from the image map is stored. A really good problem or example of a problem that occurs between client-side image maps and server-side ones is that can be seen when you deal with actual map software. So things like Google Maps, for example. When you're dealing with any kind of problem with server-side image maps or client-side image maps, it's best to just have your IT professionals sort it out for you, as long as they understand that client-side image maps are the ones you desire, because in general, server-side image maps just can't be made accessible. I'm going to show you an example of this problem here, so pardon me while I change between screens here. On that same ICAPS website, we've created a map and list of information about the ICAPS colleges in Illinois. So this is an example of a server-side image map. It's got a plugin that allows its functionality, different links associated to different points, lots of different information that can be presented in multiple ways, and it's very complex. But importantly, when you click on an area in this map, the server analyzes the pixel by pixel area that you're clicking and translates that into what it is. Because as you can see, when we look at Blackhawk College's example here, it's not bound to a specific area. It can be moved, and so the server has to interpret where things are and then transmit the data. This is not an accessible feature. So in this case, what we've had to do is create a plain text version that provides all the same relevant information that can be used by users with disability. So it's important to remember, if you do need to use one of these server-side maps, a good option is to provide that same content in another way, like we have here with our plain text version. So we'll say a little bit more about plain text versions as we move on later, but for now, what you really need to understand about image maps is that there is a right kind to use for accessibility, and that if you aren't going to use those, you need to provide the information in another fashion. So section 6 is sound. These are mostly lists of do's and do nots. So 6.1, do not convey information with sound alone. 6.2, do not automatically play audio. 6.3, provide text transcripts for audio containing speech when it's provided for public and or required to be viewed by employees. This section is fairly straightforward. 6.3 focuses on providing equivalent access for audio information using a visual format. Transcripts and subtitles are commonly used to fulfill this requirement. Section 7, multimedia, shares this focus, but expands the focus to all multimedia forms and ensures content is accessible both visually and in audio formats. As you probably noticed, I've made an effort to read a lot of the content directly from the webinar. Again, this is done to ensure visual information was communicated in another form. So just a word on creating things like subtitles for your presentations, though. It can be a very time-consuming, technical, and frustrating process, especially if you attempt to use free products. So there are a lot of options for products out there, but understand that the amount of time it takes to transcribe a video in 2-second bursts and then integrate that text into a program that converts it to subtitles and hardwires them onto a video can be very frustrating and fairly user intense. There are a lot of specialized services that do this for people, or more user-friendly programs, but they do tend to come with a price. So an important thing to understand is when you're developing your web content, it's often a lot more beneficial to you. It will save time and money if you create it in accessible fashion in the first place instead of trying to add in accessibility features after the fact. All right, we'll go through a couple more of these and then pause for questions again. So Section 8, animation. Provide means of pausing any moving, blinking, scrolling, or auto-updating information. And then do not include content that flashes faster than 3 times per second. A word on this is that flashing faster than 3 times a second can trigger epileptic seizures. So the state guidance on how to avoid doing this is fairly simple. It just says don't do it under any circumstances. If you have something on your website that does that, contact your site administrator and simply have it removed. Sometimes it takes a little outside the box thinking on how to rework some of these things, but this is a very simple case of just don't do it and remove anything that does it. Section 9 talks about links, and so by that we're referring both to website hyperlinks and navigation links across the page. The criteria here are 9.1, ensure that links are understandable out of context. 9.2, provide a means of skipping past repetitive navigation links. 9.3, avoid using small links. And by that it means 16 by 16 pixel minimum picture size, standard or enlarged font sizes for text links, and avoid using text links that are shorter than 4 characters in length. Another important thing to think about is when using things like click here or words as links, grouping them together in a sentence can be very, very difficult to navigate. So try to avoid that. 9.4 there is ensure the same picture links move keyboard focus as well as screen focus. So a lot of this is provided again through that alt text feature. I generally, in any link of any kind, still include alternate text that describes the location it's going to or provides the URL specifically so that it can be understood that it is a link to all users. All right, so we've got a few more to go. Does anyone have any questions thus far? Don't be afraid to ask, because I know we're moving pretty quick through it and it's kind of dense. No questions. All right. So we're getting closer to the end though, so thank you for bearing with me so far, guys. I'm going to work on Section 10 now, which is forms. This is one of the biggest problems that people run into, and it's also one of the more complicated issues in terms of web accessibility. One of the reasons that's the case is because forms created in Microsoft Office products or Adobe generally just can't be made accessible. There is no way to do it because they don't give you the kind of control you need to provide full accessibility. Another complication is that common features like radio buttons, which are a multiple choice section in which choosing an answer automatically deselects other answers, are very difficult to design correctly. And even then, they are really difficult to ensure access to for assistive technologies. Proper labeling and logical layouts can increase form accessibility, so you can do things that are close in MS Word or in Adobe, but generally they won't be fully accessible. So the criteria for Section 10 are provide labels or titles for all form fields. 10.2 is provide legends for groups or of form fields. 10.3 is ensure that form fields are in a logical tab order. 10.4, avoid placing non-focusable text between form fields. And so to elaborate on that, instructions should be given within form fields if possible. If instructions are too long to fit within labels, they should be provided in an instruction section before the beginning of the form. If neither of those works, consider using a text technique that makes text elements focusable. So this is another example of the legislation providing some guidance that would be very, very difficult to actually implement. You're far better off going with one of the earlier options, because if those approaches don't work, I don't know of many techniques that still can make text elements focusable on a form. And I wonder if maybe they were thinking that something would be developed, but as is right now, provide instructions in the label field or in a separate instruction section. Then 10.5 is ensure that text and form fields can be enlarged. So designing proper forms will likely take a degree of coding knowledge. I just want to let you know that right now. However, another option is by using a program like FormStack. Many of these programs have fully accessible templates because they were designed to be used by all sorts of organizations, and it was a federal requirement. But it's important to remember that the way these programs achieve accessibility is by designing templates that don't make use of features like radio buttons that cause barriers. So it is still possible to create something in FormStack that is not accessible at all. That's one of the reasons why it's really important for you to test your forms by attempting to fill them out using assistive technology or using some of the resources we'll be providing for you. In the case of something like a screen reader, it's often a good idea to use more than one, because each different screen reading program engages with forms in a slightly different way. So you could use 3 or 4 and identify 3 or 4 different sets of issues. We're not focusing on designing content on this webinar, but I've still included a couple resources at the bottom of this page. The first provides a guide on how to correctly code labels and unfillable forms, and it provides examples of doing so. If you do have forms during your self-assessment that you need to fix right away, that's a very good resource to go through. But again, it will require a significant degree of coding knowledge. The second is a more in-depth view of the specific issues that occur when creating fillable forms. So that may help with self-assessment, and it will definitely provide a good look into where barriers occur so you can simply avoid them. All right, section 11 deals specifically with tables. 11.1, identify a header cell for each column or row in simple data tables. And 11.2, identify relations in complex data tables using ID and header attributes. 11.3 is provide summary attributes for data tables. The IITAA's how-to section on these issues provides relatively simple explanations on how to use header and ID attributes to make tables or to make those tables that you've already created more accessible. If tables are created logically and are not used as a stylistic tool, then they should be easily handled by assistive technology. The best advice I can give you on this is keep your tables as simple as possible. Break down complex tables into multiple simple tables. Use onboard features within things like Word or PowerPoint to create them, and don't copy versions from other programs, because if you put them in as something like a JPEG, they will be completely inaccessible, and it is generally a lot more work to try to create narrative content that expresses the same ideas. And provide alt text. If you do any form of table at all, alt text to explain basic or important features of the table is essential for users with disability. It also will allow people to examine if they want to view the table more closely with assistive technology, because the alt text will be read first. So a quick summary of that will help them determine the relevance of the table to what they're looking at. Section 12 here is going to deal with frames. Frames are areas used to divide web pages. The guide for frames is rather straightforward. 12.1 is provide concise, unique, and understandable titles for frames. 12.2 is avoid using hidden, empty, or non-essential frames. Blank frames make it far more difficult to navigate pages using assistive technology, and the use of titles for frames is really just good practice for any website. If you imagine a website divided into four quadrants, and one is filled with a list of dates and times, you have no way to determine the meaning of that if you don't have some sort of title that provides context. All right, we're getting pretty close to the end here, guys. There are only a few more. So section 13 is scripts. 13.1, ensure that scripted functions are usable with assistive technology. Err on the side of safety by ensuring that the essential elements of the page do not rely on scripts. 13.2 is ensure that significant interactions can be performed with both keyboard and mouse. 13.3 is avoid changing focus unexpectedly, and 13.4 is avoid changing content unexpectedly. So fixing scripts is another one of those issues that should just be left to professional IT people. You can test your website for script errors pretty easily, but the only consistent way to do that is to use the technology, assistive technologies, as a way to vet the site, because all sorts of different scripts interact with coding in different ways, so there aren't script testing programs out there that are reliable with multiple types of script. So Java is a really good example of this that is used on a lot of websites. There are Java testing tools, but chances are you use multiple types of script on each site, and it's just a better idea to go through with assistive technology so that you can identify specific issues and then forward it on to your IT professionals to provide fixes for. So do we have any more questions before we move on to the last few of these? All right, so section 14.
That's, I mean, right now, if you need, that's what I'm telling you guys to do, have case service dollars.
So can you hold on one second? Hey, Amy, I've got some feedback I'm getting here. All right. Okay, sorry about that, guys. So section 14 is embedded objects. 14.1, use accessible embedded objects whenever possible. 14.2, if an inaccessible embedded object must be used, provide an accessible alternative that includes the same content and functionality. We saw a really good example of that earlier with the map that we had embedded in our website. Other common examples are media players that play videos. Again, the issue with this is just design the content accessibly in the first place, or when you put it onto your website, it won't be accessible. Section 15 is very similar. Downloadable documents, provide natively accessible downloadable documents whenever possible. And the next webinar in the series will discuss specifically how to create those and walk us through some of the accessibility issues and really show you accessible design. 15.2 is if a downloadable document cannot be made natively accessible, provide an accessible alternative that includes the same content and functionality. An important note is some programs cannot be made fully accessible. Fillable forms that we just discussed are the best example, because MS Word documents or PDFs cannot be made accessible using them. Also important, for any PDF to have any accessibility features at all, it must have the tags enabled. So before we get off this webinar today, I am going to show you how to do that. Whoops. Sorry. Okay, so here are the last three here. These are all pretty straightforward. So section 16 is timing. 16.1, notify users of time limits and provide a means to extend time if possible. 16.2, to not automatically refresh the current page. 16.1 presents a difficulty for websites with logins and sessions that time out. It's advisable that you don't use those features for any required content. If session times are limited, they have to be made explicit so that your users can understand how much time they'll be given on a page. It's worth noting that assistive technology is a lot more time consuming to use than navigating with a scrolling through with a mouse. It also limits a user's ability to scan at the same rate. So providing longer time frames for users with assistive technology is another option. In terms of 16.2, the auto refresh is an intentional result of a command http-equiv equals refresh. That's one of the only ways that it can be done. So there won't be a case in which this is something that's happening accidentally on your page. Simply don't use this command. If you encounter an auto refresh, consult your web administrator. They're not to be used. And I mean, it is a requirement. Don't use automatic refresh. So the final thing here is, or the final two are section 17, page layout. 17.1, when using tables for layout, ensure they read in a logical order. 17.2, when using style sheets for layout, ensure the reading order is logical. 17.3, avoid horizontal scrolling. So at this point, I hope you can see that logical design is a really important factor in almost all of these criteria. If you're going to make your website accessible, a simple idea behind it is that logical design makes it easier to navigate. So the best way to test logical reading order is to use a screen reader to proof a page to ensure that the tags in your document actually correspond to the logical order that you've presented on the page. Adobe has an onboard feature to edit reading order, and we're going to actually run through that before the close of this webinar. The final section, 18, deals with alternate accessibility content. 18.1 says use separate accessible versions only as a last resort. Nearly every checklist that you run across will make a similar case as why text-only versions should be used sparingly. Simply put, they're not kept current and don't provide equal informational experience to the user or allow for any sort of level of engagement. In some cases, like the one I showed you earlier with the image map, a text-only version can be necessary, but I would still say if you follow accessibility guidelines, they're rarely needed. It is important if you do use them that every time you update your page, you update the text-only version accordingly. So we've gone through all the legislative requirements now for Illinois, and these do closely correspond with the federal regulations, which will also be provided for you. Does anyone have any questions over the legislation and its requirements before we move on to the last little bit, which is walking through a few self-assessment accessibility features that are on board common programs? There are no hands up. Okay, excellent. So then let us briefly turn our attention to resources to help you self-assess. So there are a number of different ways that you can self-assess your online communication. As I said before, the most effective way is simply to run through your content with assistive technologies. It will be the most accurate, and it will allow you to understand the user experience a little better, so potentially it will help you design better content in the future. Another option are free accessibility checkers. Wave Web Accessibility Evaluation Tool is one I've included here because it identifies potential issue and creates a visual markup of your site to highlight where problems occurs. It also identifies structural elements that may be problematic and require closer examination. That doesn't mean that the things these tools identify are problems, it's generally that they're potential problems, and they work by accessing the code and identifying design elements where issues tend to occur. Wave is a really good option because of the visual markup on your site. Most other programs only provide you a report, and I think the visual markup makes it more user-friendly and really gives you a better understanding of where your design process is coming up short on accessibility. There are also a lot of other options. I've provided the resource list from w3.org. It has more options than you will ever use, at least 50 on there. Again, they all work fairly similarly. We don't endorse a specific option, but they are all worth checking out. So find the one you like best. Okay, so now we're going to get into a couple common onboard tools, and I'm going to read through this first and then show you exactly how to access these, so that way you'll be able to actually see their functionality. So onboard tools for MS Office include the Accessibility Checker, which is located under the File menu by going to Info, Check for Issues, and Check Accessibility. This thing checks alternate tags, structural elements, contrast ratios, and other accessibility issues, and prompts you on how to fix them. So I'm going to go ahead and get up one of the resources that we'll be providing you here in Words mode. So if you can see where my highlighter is here, up at the top, these are the menus that we're going to be using. So under File, let me just call that back up here. So again, we'll be doing File, Info, Check for Issues, Check Accessibility. So Info is almost automatically selected. Under the Inspect Document, Check for Issues is what you'll want to click on, and move down to Check Accessibility. I've gone through and turned a lot of these into other document types already, but you can see here this one has come across a real issue. It is unable to run the accessibility checker because tagging is not turned on. So what will happen in this, and this was done to show you just a simple example of an identified problem, but all of these problems would be identified. So if there are problems with the tables and the tags in them, they'd be listed here. You could double click them and it would direct you directly to it, and then it will provide a text on how to make those features more accessible. So that's a really handy tool. It's a quick thing to run before you produce any sort of document. The other thing in Word that is essential if you're going to convert Word files into any other documents is Save with Active Tags. So this will be located under the File menu, under the Saving options, so Save As. Then you'll click More Options, PDF will be selected from the drop-down menu, and then you'll need to check the Document Structure Tags for Accessibility option within a submenu that opens up. Without this enabled, PDFs cannot be made accessible because they won't have any of the onboard tagging features built into them. So this is a little more complicated because I'm sure we're all happy to go here under Menu, generally would click Save As, and work directly from this screen. In order to access this feature, you'll go from Save As, and you'll have to click More Options. It'll open up this submenu here, and then you'll need to select PDF from your drop-down on this screen, because from here you can get into the Options menu that I've clicked here and turn on Document Structure Tags for Accessibility. Once you turn this on, it should be set as the default, but I would check it 2 or 3 times to make sure that you're always allowing this feature to be saved. And I would always go through this style of menu to save something as a PDF. Okay. So we're now going to look at onboard tools for Adobe. It has a few more than Word because a lot of the accessibility features that you'd need to do to a PDF are already done from the user interface on a Word document. The first is the PDF Accessibility Checker. It's located under Advanced menu, Accessibility Quick Check. It does the same thing as the other accessibility checker we saw. So checks your alt tags, structural elements, contrast ratios, and a number of other accessibility issues, and then prompts you on how to fix them. So that one can be found here. So what I'm going to do is, this is an open PDF, gone up to Advanced, and Accessibility is the top option, and here we have a quick check and a full check. So you'll see this option. It lets you run through all the different things that you want to test, and it's generally a good idea to just test everything, and it will run through. So I have no problems in this document. Generally, if you do encounter problems, a menu will open up on the side of the screen, and it will again take you directly to the issue like this, and under Summary, you'd find ways to fix those issues using the onboard features on Adobe. Let me go back up here. Apologies. So the final two features are touch-up reading order and touch-up object. These are used to readjust the tags that are created in other programs and then exported to Adobe. So I'll go through them separately, but I'll just read the slide here real quickly. Touch-up reading order is located under the Advanced menu, Accessibility, and touch-up reading order. It allows you to edit reading order of text for text readers, and also the order is usually set by the order in which content is created in other programs, not a logical structure. So if you don't do this, there's a good possibility any of the edits you made while creating another document will have been tagged and worked into the reading order. For touch-up objects, we'll go under the Tools menu to Advanced Editing and Touch-up Objects. And this allows you to adjust images and add in alt text and tags if they haven't been tagged when they were originally created. So the first thing here is under Advanced and Accessibility. Again, we can go all the way down to touch-up reading order. You'll open this menu, and you'll want to do Show Order Panel, which will allow you to go through and test the reading order on multiple pages. So it looks like here the reading order has been pretty much set the way I want it to be. You can see it takes just a little time to read through it and check. So a screen reader would most likely have no difficulty reading this in the logical order I've set up. When you will run into more problems is when you do things like different text spaces on a PowerPoint and then convert it to a PDF, or something like using InDesign or Publisher, because those are always tagged based on the order in which content was created. So let me close this out here. Now, to adjust the images, you'd go to Tools, and Advanced Editing, and Touch-up Object Tool. Now, I don't have a lot of objects in this, but what you do is once you've turned that on, any object you could select, such as a picture, will open, and you'll have a menu to add alt text. So again, it'd be under under Tools, Advanced Editing, Touch-up Text, Touch-up Object, or Touch-up Reading Order, also available through Accessibility. Touch-up Reading Order. Okay. So with that, we're getting to the end here. You can see the sources we've used in this document. Under here, you'll also find guides for Section 508 standards from the U.S. Accessibility Board, so you can directly access the 508 standards there. You have the IITAA implementation guidelines that you can access through the Illinois Department of Human Services, which also have all of the guidance that I've referenced and could be used as a checklist, as well as a few other sources here that just might be helpful as you work through. And with that, I want to thank you for your participation. I also encourage you to check out the resources we've linked to the webinar. There will be self-assessment guides and checklists for Adobe, PowerPoint, Microsoft Word, and then general websites on there. So hopefully they're a great resource for you. If you have any questions at all on any of this information that we've touched on, or need further guidance with other web accessibility issues, you can get in contact with me or go to our website there, and we'll be happy to assist you any way we can. So that's all I have for you guys. So thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you, everyone. Have a fantastic day.